Okay, we're back. You're listening to KTAL LP FM in Las Cruces, New Mexico. This is a segment, Science. Let's take a look. I'm Vince Gucic, your host. And we've been talking about thanking bacteria for what they do. In the first segment, I talked about how they're making vitamins for us. Vitamin K, common E. coli bacteria in our gut. Lots of bacteria making vitamin B12. For all of us who have nervous systems, that's particularly important. It's also used by the bacteria. And then I got on to how bacteria made oxygen available over geologic time. And it was cyanobacteria for a number of reasons. We know that for a number of reasons, how ancient their lineage is, some fossils, things like biologic compounds, sterols, showing up at the time of the red beds being formed. And that's where oxygen reacted with the abundant iron in the oceans and basically rained it out, made precipitates of very insoluble ferric hydroxide. Okay. Now, it's one thing to have oxygen, but we have to have a way in our own body cells to use oxygen safely. Oxygen is potentially dangerous. There's lots of so-called active oxygen species that can be made from ordinary oxygen, peroxide, superoxide, singlet oxygen, and so on. So we have pretty controlled metabolism of it. And we also really restrict our direct use of oxygen almost entirely to mitochondria. Those are organelles, parts within the cells that do the reaction combining oxygen with organic compounds, basically derivatives of glucose, sugar, to run reactions that generate intermediate energy carriers like ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And we don't need to go into detail, but complex forms of life originated after the so-called eukaryotic cell evolved. And that is cells like ours that have compartments within them. So there's a compartment for the nucleus with all our genetic material, and then there are organelles such as the mitochondria for our energy processing. Now, there's a wealth of evidence that the mitochondria formed when some of the bacteria that could use oxygen got captured by other cells, and instead of being digested, they ended up as endosymbionts. That is, they're kept within the cell alive. It must have been a very rare event, but doesn't have to happen frequently. Once the endosymbionts start thriving and start dividing and replicating on their own inside our cells, that's happening all the time. And there's all kinds of fascinating stories about things that go right and go wrong with these mitochondria in our cells. In any case, there's some recent examples, current, happening all the time, of cells that get eaten but not digested. You may have heard of nudibranchs, which are basically shellless mollusks. I'm sorry, they're not mollusks. Anyway, there's a form called glaucus. It's sort of pretty, and it ends up eating jellyfish out in the ocean, but it keeps the stinging cells intact, the cnidocytes, and it uses them for its own defense. Anyway, another thing that happened besides us getting the ability to use oxygen with the mitochondria in our own cells is that plants, and ultimately green plants, got the organelles that could create the free oxygen, the chloroplast. They basically look like cyanobacteria inside our cells that keep going on, well, not our cells, plant cells. Okay. Then there's the effect on climate, which was massive. So the deal was that the original Earth's atmosphere was what we call reducing in a chemical sense. There were no oxygenated compounds of note. The atmosphere was full of methane, ordinary natural gas. And the problem is when oxygen became abundant, the methane in the atmosphere got oxidized. So what? Well, methane is a great greenhouse gas. And depending on the concentration, you could say in the current atmosphere, it's anywhere between 25 and 72 times more potent per molecule than carbon dioxide is. And we know carbon dioxide is a major greenhouse gas. So the Earth was losing its greenhouse effect. And that was a bad thing because at that time in geologic history, the sun's output, and I'm talking 2.2 billion years ago, was only about 70% of what it is now. That meant when the greenhouse effect went from a potent methane effect to a kind of wimpy carbon dioxide effect, the Earth got very cold. That episode was known as Snowball Earth, and it happened at least twice. What does that mean? It means that the Earth froze over almost entirely. We don't know if it was entirely, but close. And part of the evidence is that there are these things called drop stones. They are big rocks that were moved by glaciers, and they're basically found all over the world where the continents and seafloor were in their current positions, or not their old positions, I mean. And then, of course, there's the other elements that were affected. Sulfur, there's a big sulfur cycle on the surface of the Earth, and there are several different forms of sulfur, different isotopes, same number of protons makes them sulfur, different numbers of neutrons that makes them different weights. And through various organic or abiological chemical reactions, you get different ratios of these isotopes in the products. And anyway, that's been traced and said, this was an abiological thing where the methane and the sulfur all got oxidized away by all this new oxygen. Now, it's not just the cyanobacteria. It's possible that the red beds, the depletion of iron in the ocean also was contributed by some purple photosynthetic bacteria that oxidized the iron. But anyway, very, very cold planet. That was almost the end of life on Earth. This sort of goes against the hypothesis of Gaia, the goddess of the Earth illusion, where the Earth acts as a superorganism to maintain life. Well, cyanobacteria almost killed off all of us, including themselves. So then what happened? Well, eventually there were enough volcanic eruptions over about 50 million years to put enough carbon dioxide in the air to warm the climate, melt the ice, and then there was a positive feedback because with less ice that reflects away the sunlight, more sunlight got absorbed on the Earth, and the Earth became much, much warmer, and it overshot some evidence that the temperature reached 50 degrees Celsius, 122 Fahrenheit. Well, now it's all fairly stabilized, and we're lucky we have the current climate. So let's go back to how we use oxygen along with many of our fellow species. What's so great about aerobic metabolism that uses oxygen? Well, it's the energy yield. A very common substrate, you might say nutrient, for life to get energy is sugar, like glucose, half of a common sucrose molecule. And if that is oxidized all the way to carbon dioxide and water vapor using oxygen, then the body, with all of its enzymes, can make 36 molecules of ATP, this energy carrier, for every one of those glucoses, you might say, burned up. But if you don't use oxygen and you rely on anaerobic metabolism, and that's fermentation, you end up with lactic acid or ethanol, alcohol. You only get 2. So the turnover is a lot better if you're using oxygen. Now, we can do anaerobic metabolism when we have to. But when we do that, we accumulate lactic acid. And that's a problem, as runners know, when they have to run without, intensely, without the ability to take in enough oxygen. The place where it's much more serious is in the brain and all other nervous tissue that needs a very rapid oxygen supply. So our brains are 2% of our body mass, but they use 20% of our oxygen. So we've got to keep those nerves firing. Anaerobic metabolism doesn't do it. So if you are deprived of oxygen, your brain is the first thing to suffer. Now, after we've done that, the next big topic is bacteria are our ancestors of us all. The evidence that all life evolved from bacteria is abundant and overwhelming. Of course, life had to start as simple cells first. That was really tricky. You can look up Manfred Eigen, E-I-G-E-N, and a whole host of modern research by other people. Manfred got the Nobel Prize. I don't remember exactly when. Anyway, we ended up with multicellular organisms evolving much, much later. So first simple cells, 3.5 billion years ago, or maybe earlier. And multicellular, I'm not sure, less than 1 billion years ago. And then complex forms like us, multicellular animals, are very late. Now, one of the neat pieces of evidence that we're all derived from bacteria is that we share their genetic code. In fact, all organisms share the same genetic code with very few differences. And we also share using proteins to do our metabolism, and RNA, ribonucleic acid, for intermediates in taking genetic information to make proteins. Basically, as my wife put it, if somebody took a little biopsy of you, skin cells, and then cells from a sponge, and ground them both up and showed you what chemicals were there and what enzymes were there, your own mother would have a hard time telling you apart. Now, there's a really interesting book called The Ancestor's Tale. It's by Richard Dawkins, a biologist, I think he's at Oxford, and he traces the evolution of life backwards from us all the way back to the bacteria. It's a fascinating story. It's about time for another station break, and I'm going to go on to some more things that bacteria are doing for us right now. So please stay tuned, and we'll see you in a bit.